The letter shook in James Wilson's hands as he read his grandfather's final instructions. Break through the north basement wall. 6 simple words that made no sense. Standing amid the withered cornfields of Meadow Creek Farm, James felt the weight of failure crushing down on him. 3 generations of Wilson innovation reduced to dust, and now this cryptic message from beyond the grave. The inheritance of his grandfather's struggling farm was supposed to be his chance to reconnect with his roots after a soul-crushing decade in tech. Instead, he found himself with mounting debts, failing equipment, and a mysterious directive to demolish part of the 150-year-old farmhouse foundation. What begins as reluctant compliance with his grandfather's strange request leads James to a hidden chamber, sealed since the Civil War. What he doesn't realize is that the weathered journals and strange metal contraption concealed behind that stone wall aren't just family heirlooms. They're the lost inventions of Thomas Reed, a brilliant engineer whose revolutionary agricultural designs mysteriously vanished from history during Reconstruction. As local historian Dr. Sarah Mitchell helps authenticate his discovery, James finds himself torn between selling the valuable historical find to save the farm and revealing innovations that could transform modern agriculture but might cost him the land his family has worked for generations. This unforgettable journey reveals how true legacy isn't measured in acres or dollars, but in the courage to unearth buried truths and nurture seeds of innovation planted by those who came before us. Before we dive deeper, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The December wind cut across the barren fields of Meadow Creek, farm like a scythe, harvesting what little warmth remained in the Pennsylvania afternoon. James Wilson walked the eastern boundary of his grandfather's property, boots crunching through frost-stiffened grass where the season's final hay cutting should have stood. 3 years of agricultural market collapse had etched lines into his face that matched the worry-worn furrows in the soil beneath him. At 38, James Wilson looked a decade older than when he'd left for Silicon Valley 15 years ago. His once eager expression now weathered by the harsh realities of returning to a dying family legacy. His shoulders, once squared with the confidence of a rising tech executive, now hunched slightly against the bitter wind and the burden of impending decisions. "Not exactly the retirement plan I pitched you, is it, Scout?" he said to the aging German shepherd padding faithfully at his side. The dog whined softly, pressing against his leg as if offering solidarity in their shared displacement. The bank's final notice had arrived yesterday, giving him 60 days before foreclosure proceedings would begin. 150 acres that had once showcased the most innovative farming techniques in Riverdale County, reduced to a worthless expanse of underperforming soil and outdated equipment. The remaining tractor needed repairs he couldn't afford, and the irrigation system had failed in 3 sections during the summer drought. James pulled his worn woolen cap lower as he squinted toward the farmhouse in the distance. The white clapboard was graying with age. The red barn behind it faded to the color of dried blood. His grandfather Harold had planted maple trees along the driveway decades ago. They were the only things still thriving, their stubborn autumn brilliance a defiant last stand against the encroaching winter. The sound of tires on gravel drew his attention. A cloud of dust announced a visitor long before the blue postal jeep came into view. Eleanor Simmons had been delivering mail in Riverdale for nearly 30 years and knew everyone's business before they did. "Afternoon, Jimmy?" she called, using his childhood name with the casual familiarity of small towns. "Got something interesting for you." She handed him a thick envelope with unfamiliar handwriting. "Griffin and Powell, attorneys at law. Looks important." James nodded non-committally, knowing whatever he said would circulate through town before sunset. After Eleanor drove away, he tore open the envelope, expecting perhaps another debt he'd forgotten. Instead, he found himself staring at a formal letter that began, "As the executor of Harold Wilson's final wishes, I am instructed to deliver this letter to you exactly 1 month after the reading of his will." The enclosed, handwritten letter was in his grandfather's unmistakable script, the pencil strokes pressed deeply into the paper as if ensuring they would endure. "James, if you're reading this, you've stuck it out at Meadow Creek for at least a month. I always knew you had Wilson's stubbornness in you, even when you were chasing those computer dreams out west. There's something I never told you, something I never told anyone except my own father, who heard it from his father before him. Go to the basement, the north wall behind the old coal chute. Break through it. What you'll find there might just save everything, or change everything. It should have been shared long ago, but promises made in harder times kept it hidden. I'm sorry for the secrets, son. Some burdens skip generations until they find the right shoulders. Your grandfather, Harold." James sank down onto a nearby stump, letter clutched in his trembling hands. His grandfather had been sound of mind until the end, practical to a fault and never given to flights of fancy. If Harold Wilson had hidden something in the basement wall and kept it secret his entire life, he'd had good reason. That evening, Maggie's diner buzzed with the news of James's mysterious letter. Word traveled at the speed of coffee refills in Riverdale. Tom Baker, whose family had farmed neighboring land for generations, slid into the booth across from James. "Heard old Harold left you a treasure map," Tom said, signaling the waitress for coffee. "Eleanor says you got some kind of secret instructions." "I wouldn't call it a treasure map," James replied, pushing the remains of his meatloaf around his plate. "More like a renovation project I don't have time or money for." Tom studied him over the rim of his coffee mug. "You planning to stick around then? Mayor Collins says Richard Gentry's been asking about your acreage, offering cash." The mention of Gentry development soured what remained of James's appetite. Richard Gentry was Harold's second cousin once removed, with no love for farming but plenty of interest in turning agricultural land into luxury home sites. He'd been eyeing Meadow Creek Farm for years, waiting for Harold to give up. Now he was, circling James instead. "I'm not selling to Gentry," James said, with more conviction than he felt. "At least not yet." Tom nodded slowly. "Your granddad would appreciate that. Harold Wilson believed in keeping land in production. Said once you pave over topsoil, you lose something that took centuries to create. My grandfather also believed in paying his debts," James countered. "Hard to honor both when the bank's about to take everything anyway." "Dick, so what's this about breaking down walls?" Tom asked, lowering his voice. James hesitated. Tom Baker had been his grandfather's closest friend, but something held him back from sharing the full details. Apparently, Grandpa left something in the basement, behind a wall. Tom's expression changed subtly, a flicker of something, recognition, concern, crossing his weathered features. Harold was a complicated man, carried burdens from his father's time, and his father before him. He stood, dropping cash on the table for his coffee. "Whatever you find, Jimmy, you'll just remember there's more than one kind of inheritance. Some are heavier than others." Later that night, as James sat at his grandfather's kitchen table reviewing the farm's dismal financial records, his phone rang. It was Richard Gentry. "James, heard you're going through some papers of Harold's," Gentry said without preamble. "Finding your way around the old place all right?" "I'm managing," James replied, instantly wary. "What can I do for you, Richard?" "I'll be direct. I'm prepared to make you an offer on Meadow Creek, above market value. Enough to clear the debts and give you a fresh start back in California." James stared out the window at the darkened fields. "I've only been here a month. I'm not ready to make that decision. "The bank's not going to wait forever," Gentry said, his voice taking on an edge. "Harold lets sentiment cloud his business judgment. That's why the farm's failing." "I'll keep that in mind," James said neutrally. "Good night, Richard." After hanging up, James sat in the quiet kitchen, his grandfather's letter spread before him. Scout dozed at his feet, occasionally twitching in dreams of chasing rabbits through fields long gone to seed. The basement, the north wall. Breakthrough. It made no sense. The basement of the farmhouse was old, part of the original foundation from the 1870s, when the first James Wilson, his great-great-grandfather and namesake, had established Meadow Creek Farm after returning from the Civil War. The north wall was solid stone, with the remnants of an old coal chute that had been sealed up decades ago when the house converted to oil heating. What could possibly be hidden there that had been kept secret for generations? And why tell him now, when the farm was on the verge of slipping away from the Wilson family forever? James pulled on his jacket and grabbed a flashlight. Scout rose, immediately ready for adventure despite his arthritic hips. Together, they crossed the darkened kitchen and opened the door that led to the basement stairs. The wooden steps creaked under his weight, protesting like everything else on the aging farm. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the familiar basement with its rough stone walls and dirt floor in sections where no concrete had been poured. Old preserving jars lined wooden shelves, most empty now, but still, waiting faithfully for the next harvest that might never come. The north wall was partially obscured by decades of accumulated farm equipment, broken tools waiting for repair, parts salvaged from machinery long obsolete, the physical archive of a family that wasted nothing. It took James nearly 20 minutes to clear enough space to examine the wall properly. The old coal chute was evident, a square opening about 3 feet wide that had been filled in with smaller stones and mortar. But as James ran his flashlight slowly across the surface, he noticed something odd. The mortar around the chute was different from the rest of the wall, newer perhaps, though still decades old, and the stones had been placed with peculiar precision, unlike the functional randomness of the foundation wall. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Someone sealed this up deliberately," he murmured to Scout, who watched with canine curiosity, "and did a damn good job of it." James returned to the kitchen and rummaged through the mudroom until he found a hammer and chisel from his grandfather's tool collection. Back in the basement, he positioned the chisel against the mortar line and struck it with the hammer. A small chunk broke away, revealing more mortar beneath. He struck again and again, establishing a rhythm as he worked to create a hole large enough to see what might lie beyond. It was nearly midnight when the chisel finally broke through to emptiness. James worked faster then, enlarging the hole until it was big enough to shine his flashlight through. The beam disappeared into darkness, suggesting a space larger than merely the filled-in coal chute. By 1 in the morning, he had removed enough stones to create an opening large enough to squeeze through. Scout whined anxiously as James prepared to enter the mysterious space. "Stay, boy," James commanded, patting the dog's head reassuringly. "I'll be right back." He pushed the flashlight ahead of him and crawled through the ragged opening in the wall. The air inside was stale but dry, preserved by the careful stonework that had sealed the chamber. His light revealed a space about 8 feet square, a room that had been deliberately created within the foundation, hidden from view for what must have been a century or more. Against the far wall stood a wooden cabinet, its surface gray with dust, but otherwise preserved by the cool, dry air. Beside it, a small desk and chair, positioned as if someone had just stepped away momentarily, expecting to return. On the desk lay several leather-bound journals, their covers cracked with age, but intact. James approached slowly, his heart pounding, with the strange intimacy of disturbing a space untouched for generations. He opened the topmost journal carefully, mindful of the fragile paper. The handwriting inside was not his grandfather's, nor any script he recognized. The date at the top of the first page read April 18th, 1872. The designs are complete. With these modifications to the seed drill, a single farmer could increase his planting efficiency by nearly 40% while reducing soil disruption. Combined with the irrigation system plans, this could transform agriculture across the drought-prone regions. JW believes we should patent immediately, but I fear what the conglomerates would do with such technology. Is profit worth the risk of control? The entry was signed simply T.R. James turned more pages, finding detailed technical drawings, calculations, and journal entries spanning several years. The writer, Thomas Reed, he eventually gathered from the text, had been some kind of agricultural engineer, apparently working in partnership with someone identified only as J.W., James Wilson, his great-great-grandfather. His flashlight beam fell on the cabinet against the wall. Setting the journal down carefully, James crossed to the cabinet and opened its doors. Inside stood a strange contraption of brass, wood, and iron, a piece of machinery unlike anything he had seen before, approximately the size of a modern microwave. It appeared to be a model or prototype, exquisitely crafted with a level of precision that seemed impossible for its era. A smaller journal lay beside the machine, this one bound in red leather. James opened it with trembling fingers and found a single entry, dated November 2nd, 1877. "We must conceal everything. The lawsuit has ruined us. Cornell's men will take all our work if found. JW offers his farm as sanctuary. We will seal the designs within his foundation walls until a time when they can be shared without fear of theft. Perhaps his son or his son's son will complete what we have begun. The future of farming deserves better than to be controlled by those who have never worked the soil." This entry was signed with both sets of initials, TR and JW. James sank down onto the dusty chair, the full weight of his discovery settling over him. This hidden room contained the lost work of his great-great-grandfather and an unknown partner, agricultural innovations that had apparently been revolutionary for their time. Innovations that someone powerful had tried to steal, forcing the inventors to conceal them within the very foundation of Meadow Creek Farm. And now, nearly 150 years later, his grandfather had directed him to this hidden legacy, at precisely the moment when the farm faced its greatest threat of being lost forever. James spent the rest of the night carefully examining the journals, piecing together the story that had been sealed away for generations. Thomas Reed, it seemed, had been a brilliant engineer who had served in the Union Army during the Civil War. He had met the first James Wilson during the conflict, where both men had developed ideas about how mechanization could transform American agriculture. After the war, they had formed a partnership. Reed brought engineering brilliance, while Wilson contributed practical farming knowledge and the land where they could test their innovations. Together, they had developed revolutionary designs for irrigation systems that conserved water, planting equipment that preserved soil quality, and harvesting tools that reduced crop loss. But their work had attracted unwanted attention. Cornell Agricultural Equipment, a rapidly expanding company with political connections, had moved to claim ownership of several key innovations. According to Reed's increasingly frustrated journal entries, Cornell had filed patents for strikingly similar designs shortly after Reed and Wilson had demonstrated their prototypes at regional agricultural fairs. The lawsuit that followed had devastated the partners financially. Without resources to fight the legal battle and facing increasing intimidation, they had made the fateful decision to hide their most groundbreaking work rather than see it fall into Cornell's hands. The final journal entries revealed their plan: to seal the designs within a hidden room in the Wilson Farmhouse Foundation, with instructions passed verbally from father to son about when and how the innovations might eventually be revealed to the world. But somewhere along the line, that chain of transmission had been broken until Harold Wilson had decided that his grandson James was the right person to finally unearth the legacy. As dawn broke over Meadow Creek Farm, James carefully gathered the most important journals and the small brass prototype. He couldn't leave everything in the hidden room any longer, not with the farm's future so uncertain. He needed to understand exactly what he had found and what it might mean. After securing the hidden entrance with a padlocked door salvaged from the barn, James showered and changed clothes, his mind racing with questions. The most pressing: who could help him authenticate and understand what he had discovered? After a quick online search, he found his answer. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, director of the Riverdale Historical Society and former professor of historical engineering at Carnegie Mellon University. According to her profile, she specialized in 19th century agricultural technology, exactly the expertise he needed. It was early afternoon by the time James parked outside the modest brick building that housed the Historical Society. He had brought one journal with him, not the most revealing one, but enough to determine whether his discovery warranted serious attention. He approached the Society's entrance with a mixture of excitement and caution, still unsure how much to share with a stranger. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and a woman looked up from arranging a display case of antique farm tools. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps early 40s, with intelligent eyes behind stylish glasses and an air of focused energy. "Welcome to the Riverdale Historical Society," she said with a professional smile that warmed as recognition dawned. "You must be James Wilson. I've been meaning to reach out. Your grandfather was one of our most dedicated supporters." "He never mentioned that," James said, surprised by this new piece of information about the man he thought he had known well. "Harold Wilson understood the importance of preserving agricultural history," she replied, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah Mitchell." Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct and assessing. Up close, he noticed the slight creases around her eyes that spoke of someone who spent considerable time peering at historical documents and artifacts. "I heard you'd returned to take over Meadow Creek," she continued. "It's one of the oldest continuously operating farms in the county, or was until recently." The subtle past tense stung, but James couldn't deny its accuracy. "That's actually why I'm here. I found something that might have historical significance, and I could use some expert guidance." Sarah's expression sharpened with interest. "What kind of something?" James hesitated, then placed the journal on the counter between them. "This was hidden in a sealed room in my basement. There are more journals, and some kind of machine or prototype. They appear to date from the 1870s. Sarah opened the journal carefully, her trained hands knowing instinctively how to handle fragile historical documents. Her eyes widened as she scanned the first pages, then looked up at James with newfound intensity. "Where exactly did you say you found this?" "Behind a wall in my basement. My grandfather left instructions to break through it after he died." Sarah turned another page, her finger tracing a technical drawing with the reverence of someone recognizing something long sought. "Do you have any idea what you've found, Mr. Wilson?" "James, please." "And no, not really. Something my great-great-grandfather and someone named Thomas Reed were working on. Some kind of agricultural innovations they hid because of a lawsuit." Sarah closed the journal carefully and fixed him with a serious gaze. Thomas Reed was one of the most brilliant agricultural engineers of the post-Civil War era. He worked on advanced farming technology decades ahead of its time, but most of his designs mysteriously vanished after a legal battle with a major agricultural equipment manufacturer of the period. She turned to a bookshelf behind the counter and pulled down a thick volume on 19th century agricultural development. Opening to a marked page, she showed him a photograph of a bearded man standing beside what appeared to be an early mechanical planter. This is the only known photograph of Thomas Reed. He disappeared from the historical record around 1877 after losing a patent infringement case against Cornell Agricultural Equipment, a case many historians believe was fraudulent. Cornell went on to become one of the largest agricultural conglomerates in America before being absorbed by modern agribusiness giants. James studied the photograph, trying to connect this historical figure to the hidden room in his basement. So this Thomas Reed was partners with my great-great-grandfather, and they hid their work at Meadow Creek Farm. Sarah nodded, her excitement barely contained behind her professional demeanor. If what you've found is authentic, and this journal certainly appears to be, you may have discovered one of the most significant lost caches of agricultural innovation in American history. The implications began to dawn on James. Would these innovations still be valuable? I mean, technology has advanced so much since then. That depends, Sarah said, choosing her words carefully. Historically, they're priceless. Practically speaking, some fundamental agricultural challenges haven't changed as much as you might think. Drought-resistant planting, soil conservation, sustainable irrigation. These were Reed's specialties, and they're more relevant than ever. She closed the book and met his gaze directly. I'd need to see everything you've found to give you a proper assessment. But based on this journal alone, what's hidden in your basement could be extraordinarily significant, both historically and practically. James made a decision. Would you be willing to come out to Meadow Creek today, if possible? I'd like to show you the room and get your professional opinion on everything that's there. Sarah glanced at her watch. I can close early. Give me 30 minutes to secure some proper document handling materials, and I'll follow you out there. As James waited in his truck while Sarah prepared, his phone buzzed with a text message from Richard Gentry. Reconsidered my offer yet? Price goes down when the bank starts proceedings. He ignored it, watching as Sarah locked up the Historical Society and approached with a professional-looking case that presumably contained her document preservation tools. Whatever was hidden in his basement was already changing the trajectory of his situation, creating possibilities where before there had been only the grinding certainty of failure. As Sarah's car followed his truck along the winding county roads toward Meadow Creek Farm, James found himself wondering about the strange sequence of events that had led to this moment. Why had his grandfather waited until after his death to reveal the hidden room? And why now, when the farm was teetering on the edge of foreclosure? The late autumn landscape passed by in a blur of harvested fields and weathered barns, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the rural Pennsylvania countryside. James found himself seeing it all with new eyes, not just as struggling farmland, but as a landscape shaped by generations of innovation and perseverance. Innovation that might have been dramatically different if Thomas Reed's designs had found their way into the world rather than being sealed behind a stone wall. They arrived at Meadow Creek Farm as the afternoon light was beginning to soften. Scout greeted them at the gate, circling Sarah's car with cautious interest before recognizing James and bounding over to welcome him home. Beautiful German Shepherd, Sarah commented as she gathered her materials. What's his name? Scout, James replied, patting the dog's head. He was my grandfather's, one of many things I inherited that I'm not sure I'm qualified to take care of. Sarah smiled sympathetically. Dogs are usually more forgiving than farms. They just need love and attention. Farms demand a bit more. That's putting it mildly, James said, leading her toward the farmhouse. The white clapboard structure stood as it had for generations, weathered but dignified against the backdrop of fallow fields. My grandfather managed it alone well into his 70s. I've got an MBA and 15 years in tech startups, and I can barely figure out which end of the tractor needs fuel. And Harold Wilson was exceptional, Sarah agreed. But he also inherited generations of knowledge that you didn't have the chance to absorb. Don't be too hard on yourself. James appreciated her kindness, but it didn't change the harsh reality of his situation. Without a financial miracle, Meadow Creek Farm would slip away from the Wilson family within months. Whether what lay hidden in the basement could provide that miracle remained to be seen. Inside the farmhouse, James led Sarah through the kitchen, with its worn linoleum and vintage appliances, past the living room, where faded photographs of Wilson ancestors watched from wooden frames, and to the basement door. Scout trotted alongside them, apparently having appointed himself tour guide and security detail combined. "The house hasn't changed much since I was a kid visiting summers," James explained as they descended the creaky wooden stairs. "Grandpa wasn't big on modernization." "That's probably a good thing for historical preservation," Sarah noted, her voice echoing slightly in the cool basement air. "Original features are increasingly rare in farmhouses this old." James guided her to the north wall, where the padlocked door now covered the opening he'd created the night before. "I secured it temporarily," he explained, removing the lock. "I wasn't sure who might come poking around." "A wise precaution," Sarah agreed, her professional demeanor giving way to barely contained excitement as James swung the improvised door open to reveal the hidden chamber beyond. He stepped back, allowing her to enter first. Her small gasp of wonder as she crossed the threshold told him everything he needed to know about the significance of what his grandfather had directed him to find. "This is..." she began, words temporarily failing her as she surveyed the small hidden room with its desk, cabinet, and remaining journals. "James, this is extraordinary. A perfectly preserved time capsule." She moved slowly around the room, her trained eye taking in details that James might have overlooked: the specific construction of the desk, the method used to seal the room, the way the journals had been arranged. Her fingers hovered over the objects without touching them, showing the ingrained caution of a professional historian. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the journals still on the desk. James nodded. "That's why you're here." Sarah opened her case and removed white cotton gloves, which she pulled on with practiced ease. Only then did she carefully open the topmost journal, turning pages with meticulous care. As she read, her expression cycled through professional, interest to surprise, and finally to something approaching reverence. "These are authentic," she said finally, looking up at James. "Without question, and they document a partnership and set of innovations that historians have speculated about for decades, but could never confirm." She turned to the cabinet, where the brass prototype still sat. "And this, may I see it?" James opened the cabinet door. "I brought one smaller piece back to the house for safekeeping, but this was too large to move easily." Sarah approached the prototype with the careful movements of someone encountering a long-lost treasure. "This appears to be a working model of Reed's variable depth seed planter, a device that could automatically adjust planting depth based on soil conditions. The patent application for this was mysteriously withdrawn in 1877, and all prototypes were thought to be destroyed." She pointed to various components of the brass and iron mechanism. "See these calibration marks? They would have allowed for precise adjustment based on soil moisture levels, something that even modern planters struggle with. And this gear system here, it's remarkably similar to components still used in high-end agricultural equipment today." James watched as she continued her examination, her expert commentary bringing to life the significance of what had been hidden away all these years. According to Sarah, the prototype was just one of several groundbreaking innovations documented in the journals, including irrigation systems that minimized water usage, soil conservation techniques decades ahead of their time, and planting methods that could have dramatically improved crop yields during the challenging economic conditions of the late 19th century. "Why would my grandfather keep this hidden?" James asked finally, the question that had been troubling him since breaking through the wall. "If these innovations are as valuable as you say, why not reveal them decades ago?" Sarah straightened, her expression thoughtful. "The journals might give us clues. From what I've read so far, Reed and your great-great-grandfather were forced to hide these innovations because of corporate theft. But the promise they made to each other was that these would be revealed when they could be shared without fear of theft." She gestured to the red leather journal James had found the night before. "May I see that one?" James handed it to her, and she carefully read the final entry, her brow furrowing in concentration. "This is fascinating. It seems they didn't just fear Cornell stealing their patents. They were concerned about the broader implications of their work being controlled by those who have never worked the soil." "Meaning what, exactly?" James asked. "I think they were worried about the democratization of agricultural technology," Sarah explained. "Reed and Wilson appear to have been designing innovations that would help individual farmers maintain independence and efficiency, particularly small to medium-sized operations. Cornell, in contrast, was moving toward equipment that favored large operations and created dependencies on their specific products." She closed the journal carefully. "It's a debate that still rages today in agricultural communities. Who controls the technology that feeds the world? Individual farmers? Corporate conglomerates? The tension between those models has shaped American farming for over a century." James leaned against the stone wall, trying to process the implications of what Sarah was saying. "So my ancestors were on the losing side of that debate. They hid their work rather than see it co-opted. And your grandfather maintained that secret," Sarah added. "The question is, why tell you now?" The answer came to James with sudden clarity. "Because the farm is about to be lost. Meadow Creek will be foreclosed on within months. He must have known that would happen eventually after he was gone." Sarah nodded slowly. "So this is your inheritance, not just the land, but the legacy of innovation that came with it. The question is, what will you do with it?" That question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Before James could formulate a response, the sound of vehicle tires on gravel drifted down from above. "Are you expecting company?" Sarah asked. James shook his head, suddenly alert. "No, everyone in town knows I'm not entertaining visitors." They hurried up the basement stairs, Scout racing ahead with a warning bark. Through the kitchen window, James could see a black SUV parked in the driveway, its tinted windows revealing nothing about the occupants. As they watched, the driver's door opened and Richard Gentry stepped out, adjusting his expensive overcoat against the chill. "It's my cousin Richard," James said, his voice tightening. "The developer I mentioned." Sarah's expression showed immediate concern. "Does he know about the hidden room?" "No one does, except you and me," James assured her. "But his timing is suspicious." Scout had positioned himself at the front door, hackles raised and a low growl emanating from his throat. The dog had never liked Richard, a sentiment James was increasingly inclined to share. "Let me do the talking," James said, as a firm knock sounded on the door. "He doesn't need to know you're a historian." Sarah nodded her understanding, removing her cotton gloves and slipping them into her pocket. James opened the door, forcing a neutral expression. "Richard, this is unexpected." Richard Gentry was a study in calculated success, from his perfectly tailored coat to his manicured nails and the subtle scent of expensive cologne. At 55, he had the confident bearing of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through persistence and leverage. "Jimmy," he said, using the childhood nickname with deliberate condescension. "I was in the area meeting with the zoning commission and thought I'd stop by to see how you're settling in." His gaze slid past James to where Sarah stood, and a flicker of something, recognition, concern, crossed his features before his professional smile returned. "I didn't realize you had company. Richard Gentry," he said, extending his hand toward Sarah. "James's cousin, twice removed on the Wilson side." "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, accepting the handshake briefly. "I'm helping James with some historical documentation of the farm." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. "Historical documentation? I wasn't aware Meadow Creek had any particular historical significance." "All family farms have history worth preserving," Sarah replied smoothly, "especially ones that have remained in the same family for generations." Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, though I've always found that people tend to romanticize the past at the expense of practical futures. Wouldn't you agree, Dr. Mitchell?" The deliberate use of her title confirmed James's suspicion that Richard knew exactly who Sarah was and why she might be at Meadow Creek Farm. The question was, how? "I find that understanding history often illuminates the most practical path forward," Sarah replied, her tone pleasantly professional but with an underlying firmness. Richard turned his attention back to James. "I wanted to discuss my offer in person. The situation is time-sensitive, and I'd hate to see you lose everything when there's a perfectly reasonable solution on the table." "This isn't a good time." "Richard," James said firmly, "I have a guest, and we're in the middle of something important." Richard's gaze hardened slightly, though his smile remained fixed. "More important than saving your family's legacy? Because that's what my offer represents, James. The chance to preserve the Wilson name in Riverdale, just in a different form." He reached into his coat and withdrew a glossy folder, which he extended toward James. The Gentry Development Group's newest project, Wilson Estates. Luxury homes built on the former grounds of historic Meadow Creek Farm, with the original farmhouse preserved as a community center and monument to agricultural heritage. James didn't take the folder. "I'm not selling, Richard, not today anyway." A flicker of genuine frustration crossed Richard's features. "The bank won't wait forever, Jimmy, and my offer has an expiration date as well. Once foreclosure begins, the property value drops significantly." "I understand business," James replied evenly. "I'll consider all my options when I'm ready. Right now, I'm asking you to respect that this is still my property and I'm not receiving visitors unannounced." Richard studied him for a long moment, his gaze calculating. Then he tucked the folder back into his coat. "Fair enough, but don't wait too long. Opportunities have a way of disappearing when we hesitate." His gaze shifted to Sarah. "A pleasure to meet you, Dr. Mitchell. Your work at the Historical Society is quite respected. I've made several donations to support your preservation efforts over the years." "Yes, I'm aware," Sarah replied, her tone neutral. "The Gentry family has always maintained connections to local history while simultaneously working to develop it." The subtle barb wasn't lost on Richard, whose smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Progress and preservation aren't mutually exclusive, Dr. Mitchell. The challenge is finding the right balance, something I hope James will consider carefully." With a final nod, he turned and walked back to his SUV, his posture rigidly controlled. They watched in silence as he drove away, gravel spraying slightly from his tires as he accelerated perhaps faster than necessary. When the vehicle was out of sight, Sarah turned to James, her expression troubled. "He knows who I am, and I suspect he has some idea of why I'm here." That's impossible, James said. No one knows about the hidden room except us. Not the specific discovery, perhaps, Sarah conceded. But he knows enough to be concerned. About a historian taking interest in Meadow Creek Farm right now. She moved to the kitchen window, gazing out at the property thoughtfully. James, there's something you should know. The Historical Society has been researching Thomas Reed for years. We've long suspected that his lost innovations might be connected to this region, though we never knew the specific location. Why didn't you mention this earlier? James asked, surprised. Professional caution, Sarah admitted. Until I saw the journals myself, I couldn't be certain what you'd found. But now that I've confirmed their authenticity, you need to understand that what's hidden in your basement isn't just historically significant. It could be enormously valuable. Valuable enough to save the farm? James asked, the question that had been foremost in his mind since discovering the hidden room. Potentially much more than that, Sarah said carefully. Some of Reed's innovations, particularly his water conservation designs, address agricultural challenges that remain unsolved, even with modern technology. If they work as documented in the journals, they could be worth millions in today's market. The implications settled over James like a heavy mantle. And if Richard somehow knows, or suspects what's here, then your decision about what to do with this discovery just became considerably more urgent, Sarah finished for him, because Cornell agricultural equipment was eventually absorbed by Gentry Agricultural Technologies. James stared at her in disbelief. My cousin's company owns the corporate descendant of the people who drove Reed and my great-great-grandfather to hide their work in the first place? Sarah nodded grimly. History has a way of coming full circle, Mr. Wilson, and I think your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing when he instructed you to break through that wall. The sun was setting over Meadow Creek Farm, casting long shadows across fields that had been in the Wilson family for generations. Fields that now represented not just land at risk of foreclosure, but the battleground for a century-old conflict over who would control agricultural innovation and, by extension, the future of farming itself. And James Wilson, who had returned to his family farm, expecting only to oversee its final days, found himself instead at the center of a legacy much larger and more consequential than he had ever imagined. The following morning broke clear and cold, with frost etching delicate patterns across the farmhouse windows. James had barely slept, his mind racing with the implications of Sarah's revelations. After Richard Gentry's unexpected visit, they had spent hours poring over the journals and discussing potential courses of action, their conversation stretching well into the night, until Sarah had finally departed with several of the journals to study more thoroughly. Now, as James stood on the porch watching the sun rise over the eastern fields, coffee mug clutched in his cold hands, the weight of decisions pressed upon him. The farm's financial situation hadn't changed. The bank would still foreclose in less than 60 days unless he found a way to satisfy the outstanding debt. But the discovery in the basement had introduced new possibilities, each with its own complications. Scout padded up beside him, nudging his leg gently. "What would you do, boy?" James asked the dog, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "What would Grandpa expect me to do?" The ringing of his phone interrupted his thoughts. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. "You're up early," he answered. "I never went to sleep," she replied, her voice tight with urgency. "James, I need you to check something. One of the journals mentions a second prototype, smaller than the one we found, possibly stored separately for security. Reed calls it the distributor. Can you look around the hidden room again?" James frowned. "What's so important about this other prototype?" "It's the key component, the technological innovation that ties all the other designs together. According to Reed's notes, it's what Cornell was most desperate to acquire. if it exists. "I'll check right now," James said, already moving toward the basement door, Scout trotting at his heels. The hidden room looked different in the morning light that filtered through the small basement windows. Dust motes danced in the air as James examined the cabinet where they'd found the first prototype. The shelf was empty now, with only a slight discoloration on the wood, showing where the device had rested for nearly a century and a half. Working methodically, James began searching the room more thoroughly. He tapped on walls, checked beneath the desk, and examined the floorboards for signs of additional hiding places. Nothing. He was about to give up when Scout began pawing at the corner of the small braided rug that covered a portion of the dirt floor. James moved to shoo him away, then paused. The dog's behavior seemed deliberate rather than random. "What is it, boy?" Scout continued pawing, a low whine emanating from his throat. James knelt and pulled back the rug, revealing packed earth that looked no different from the rest of the floor. But as he pressed against it, he felt a slight give that seemed unusual. Working with his hands, James began to dig. About 6 inches down, his fingers struck something solid. Carefully, he cleared away more soil until he revealed what appeared to be a small metal box, roughly the size of a hardcover book. It was made of copper, now green with age, but had been sealed so carefully that it appeared intact. With trembling fingers, James lifted the box from its earthen nest and brushed away the remaining soil. There was no lock, just a simple latch that yielded easily to his touch. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved it remarkably well, lay a small mechanical device unlike anything James had ever seen. It appeared to be made primarily of brass and steel, with intricate gearing visible through a glass viewing panel on one side. A series of dials and calibration marks decorated its surface, and what looked like an attachment mechanism protruded from its base. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each component fitted with precision that would be impressive, even by modern standards. James carefully lifted the device from its box, surprised by its solidity and weight. Whatever this was, it had been built to last. "I found something," he told Sarah when he called her back. It was buried under the floor. Some kind of mechanical device about the size of a book but heavier. Brass and steel with gears and calibration dials. "That's it." Sarah's voice was electric with excitement. "James, can you bring it to the Historical Society right away, and the remaining journals? I think I understand what Reed and your great-great-grandfather were working on, but I need to see the distributor to confirm." "I'll be there in 30 minutes, James promised, already heading upstairs to gather the materials. The morning had brightened into a crisp autumn day as James drove into town, the mysterious device and remaining journals secured in a padded storage container on the seat beside him. He couldn't explain the mixture of excitement and trepidation that had settled over him, a sense that whatever Sarah had discovered in the journals might fundamentally change his situation, for better or worse. As he approached the Historical Society, he noticed Sarah waiting on the front steps, her expression a mixture of anticipation and concern. She wore the same clothes as the day before, confirming her claim that she'd worked through the night. "Let's go inside," she said by way of greeting, glancing around the quiet street as if concerned about being observed. Once inside, with the blinds drawn and the "closed for research" sign hung on the door, Sarah spread out the journals she'd been studying on a large table in the Society's research room. The walls around them were lined with agricultural artifacts and photographs, documenting Riverdale's farming heritage, silent witnesses to what was unfolding. "I need to see it," she said, gesturing to the padded container. James carefully removed the small device and placed it on the table. Sarah's intake of breath was audible as she leaned forward to examine it, her trained eye taking in details a casual observer might miss. "This is it," she whispered, her voice reverent. "Reed's variable distribution regulator. It's even more sophisticated than his notes suggested." "What exactly does it do?" James asked. Sarah looked up, her eyes bright with academic excitement. "It's essentially the brain of an integrated agricultural system that Reed and your great-great-grandfather were developing. This device could regulate water flow in irrigation systems, calibrate seed distribution in planters, and adjust harvesting mechanisms, all automatically responding to soil conditions, moisture levels, and plant development." She pointed to specific components as she explained. These dials would be set based on soil conditions and crop type. The internal mechanisms would then automatically adjust connected equipment as conditions changed during the growing season. It's a form of mechanical adaptive technology that we associate more with digital systems today. "But this was designed in the 1870s, James said, struggling to grasp the implications. "Exactly," Sarah nodded emphatically. "Reed was decades ahead of his time. The principles embodied in this device weren't widely implemented until the late 20th century, and some aspects still aren't fully realized in modern equipment." She turned to the journals spread across the table. "I've been cross-referencing the technical specifications with contemporary agricultural engineering. James, some of Reed's approaches to water conservation and soil health are still more advanced than what's on the market today." "How is that possible?" James asked. "Surely in 150 years, someone else would have developed similar technology." "Agricultural development took a different path," Sarah explained. "Cornell and companies like it pushed toward greater scale and standardization rather than adaptive, soil-specific approaches. It was more profitable to sell one-size-fits-all equipment to large operations than to develop technology that helped individual farmers optimize their specific land." She indicated one of the journals. "Reed writes extensively about this tension. He believed farming should be informed by intimate knowledge of specific land, its soil composition, drainage, patterns, microclimate. His technology was designed to enhance that relationship, not replace it with industrialized agriculture." James absorbed this information slowly, its significance unfolding in his mind. So these innovations aren't just historically interesting, they represent an alternative approach to agricultural development, a path not taken. "Until now," Sarah added meaningfully. A heavy silence fell between them as the full implications settled over James. "You're suggesting I could somehow—" "What? Bring these designs to market? Patent century-old technology?" "The original patents would have expired long ago," Sarah acknowledged, "but Reed's work could be adapted and updated for modern applications. The core principles remain sound, and in some cases, revolutionary." She leaned forward, her expression intense. "James, when I was at Carnegie Mellon, I worked on a research project examining sustainable agricultural technology. The limiting factor in many modern systems is exactly what Reed solved with this device: how to create adaptable machinery that responds to specific field conditions without requiring constant manual adjustment or expensive digital systems." "And you think this could save Meadow Creek Farm?" Sarah hesitated. "It could do much more than that. Properly developed and marketed, these innovations could transform agricultural practice, especially for medium-sized farms struggling against corporate consolidation. The question is whether that's what you want, as opposed to what?" James asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Selling to the highest bidder," Sarah said bluntly. "Richard Gentry's company would pay millions for these designs, not to develop them as Reed intended, but to control them, to ensure they never compete with the equipment models that generate their current profits." The stark choice lay before him: personal financial security through selling the discovery, or the riskier path of trying to develop Reed's vision as he had originally intended. Before James could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming text. It was from Tom Baker, his grandfather's old friend and neighboring farmer. Need to talk. It's about Harold and what he hid. Come to my place when you can." James showed the message to Sarah. How would Tom know about what was hidden in the basement? Harold must have confided in someone, Sarah reasoned. We should talk to him right away. Tom Baker's farm sat adjacent to Meadow Creek, the two properties separated by a small stream that meandered through a stand of ancient oak trees. Unlike the Wilson farm, Baker's operation was still functional, though modest by modern standards. As James and Sarah drove up the long gravel drive, they could see Tom working on a tractor in the open equipment shed. He straightened as they approached, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. At 68, Tom was still robust, with the leathery tan and calloused hands of a lifelong farmer. His expression was guarded as he nodded in greeting. "Figured you might be stopping by," he said to James, "especially with the good doctor here." He nodded towards Sarah with a knowing look that suggested he was well aware of her expertise. "You know about what was in the basement," James said, not bothering with preliminaries. Tom studied him for a moment, then gestured toward the farmhouse. "Better come inside. Some conversations shouldn't happen in the open." The kitchen of the Baker farmhouse was warm and lived in, with the comfortable clutter of a working farm. Tom's wife, June, was away visiting their daughter, he explained, as he poured coffee into sturdy mugs and set them on the worn kitchen table. "Harold told me about the hidden room 40 years ago," Tom began without preamble. "Made me swear never to mention it to anyone. Said it was Wilson family business, passed down from his grandfather." "But why tell you at all?" James asked. Tom's weathered face creased in a sad smile. "Insurance, I guess you'd call it, in case something happened to him before he could pass it on. We served in Vietnam together, your grandfather and me. That kind of experience, it creates trust that goes beyond normal friendship." He took a slow sip of his coffee, gathering his thoughts. Harold believed the time wasn't right yet. The journals explained that the innovations should only be revealed when they could be shared without fear of theft. For most of his life, Harold didn't think that condition had been met. "What changed?" Sarah asked. "Everything and nothing," Tom replied cryptically. "The agricultural industry is more consolidated than ever, but the need for what's in those journals is greater too. Farms like ours are disappearing, squeezed between corporate agriculture and changing climate conditions." He fixed James with a direct gaze. "Harold didn't just leave you a farm, son. He left you a choice, one he believed only someone with both farming roots and outside perspective could make properly. The choice to reveal Reed's innovations or keep them hidden," James said. Tom shook his head. "The choice of how to reveal them, to whom, under what conditions. That's the real legacy he left you." "Did my grandfather understand what these innovations might be worth?" James asked. "Not in dollar terms," Tom admitted. "But in principle, yes. He knew they could be significant. That's why he was so careful about when and how they'd be found." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "The week before he died, Harold came to see me. Said he'd made his decision about the hidden room, that you were the right person to find it, but that timing would be critical. He wanted you to discover it when the farm was in crisis, when you'd have to make hard choices about its future." He set this up, James realized, a mixture of frustration and grudging admiration coloring his voice. He could have just told me before he died. "Would you have understood the significance?" Tom countered. "Or would you have seen it as an old man's historical curiosity? Harold believed you needed to experience the farm's challenges firsthand before you could appreciate what Reed and your great-great-grandfather were trying to protect." The conversation continued as Tom shared what he knew about Harold's thoughts regarding the hidden legacy, According to Tom, Harold had spent years researching the modern agricultural industry, trying to determine whether conditions had changed enough to justify revealing Reed's innovations. He had become increasingly concerned about climate change, water scarcity, and the vulnerability of standardized farming practices in the face of these challenges. He believed Reed's approaches might be more relevant now than ever, Tom explained, especially the water conservation and soil preservation techniques. But he also feared that corporate interests would still move to control rather than implement the innovations if they were simply thrown into the public domain. As they were preparing to leave, Tom pulled James aside while Sarah examined some antique farm implements displayed on the baker's living room wall. "There's something else," Tom said quietly. "Something Harold wanted me to tell you directly, when the time was right." He glanced towards Sarah, then back to James. "There's a connection between Reed and the Mitchell family. Sarah's great-great-grandfather worked for Cornell Agricultural Equipment as their chief patent attorney. He was involved in the lawsuit that drove Reed and your ancestor to hide their work." James felt a cold shock run through him. "Does she know?" "I don't think so," Tom replied. "It's not something the Mitchell family advertises, but Harold discovered it during his research. He didn't think it should disqualify her from helping, just that you should be aware of it when making your decisions." This revelation added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. As they drove back toward Meadow Creek Farm, James found himself studying Sarah surreptitiously, wondering if there was anything in her demeanor that might have hinted at this connection. Should he confront her about it, or wait to see if she disclosed it herself? "You're quiet," Sarah observed as they turned onto the road leading to the Wilson property. "Just processing everything Tom shared," James replied, not quite ready to reveal what he knew. "Trying to understand what my grandfather expected from me." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "It's a tremendous responsibility. These innovations could transform agricultural practice for thousands of farmers, but bringing century-old technology into the modern world won't be simple." "What would you do?" James asked, genuinely curious about her perspective, despite his new uncertainty about her motives. "Academically speaking, these discoveries should be shared openly," she said, after a moment's consideration. "Made available to everyone, especially small and medium-sized farm operations, most vulnerable to climate change and corporate pressure." She paused, then added, "But practically speaking, that approach might mean the innovations never get implemented at all. Without proper development, testing, and modern adaptation, they'd remain curiosities rather than tools for change." It was a thoughtful answer that revealed genuine consideration of the complex issues at stake. Either Sarah was an excellent actress, or Tom's revelation about her family history was indeed unknown to her. As they rounded the final curve approaching Meadow Creek Farm, James slammed on the brakes. Parked in front of the farmhouse were 3 vehicles: Richard Gentry's black SUV, a Riverdale County Sheriff's car, and an unmarked sedan with government plates. "What the hell?" James muttered, accelerating again and pulling into the driveway with more speed than caution. A small group stood on the front porch. Richard Gentry, Sheriff Mills, and 2 men in suits whose bearings screamed, "Federal agents." Scout was barking furiously from inside the house, visible through the front window. James and Sarah exited the car and approached the porch. Sheriff Mills, a heavy-set man in his 50s who had known James since childhood, looked uncomfortable. Richard Gentry, by contrast, exuded smug confidence. "James," Sheriff Mills nodded in greeting, "these gentlemen are from the Federal Historical Preservation Office. They have some questions about artifacts allegedly found on the property." "What artifacts?" James asked, feigning ignorance as his mind raced. How had they known? What exactly did they know? One of the suited men stepped forward, presenting credentials identifying him as Agent Daniel Hoffman. Mr. Wilson, we've received information that historically significant items dating to the post-Civil War era have been discovered at this location. Items that may fall under federal protection guidelines. James shot a glance at Richard, whose expression remained neutrally pleasant. "This is private property," James said, "and I haven't discovered anything that would be of interest to federal authorities. I'm afraid we have a witness statement indicating otherwise," Agent Hoffman replied, his tone professionally detached. "We have a warrant to search the premises for artifacts meeting the criteria of the Historical Preservation Act, specifically Section 12, regarding technological innovations of national significance." He produced a document which Sheriff Mills reluctantly confirmed was legitimate. "They've got the paperwork in order, James," the sheriff said apologetically. "Best to cooperate." Sarah stepped forward, her academic credentials suddenly front and center. As a professional historian specializing in 19th century agricultural technology, I can assure you that nothing found on this property meets the criteria for federal intervention under the Historical Preservation Act. That legislation specifically addresses artifacts with military or governmental significance. Though Agent Hoffman regarded her with mild surprise. "Dr. Mitchell, I presume. Your presence here is interesting. Our information suggested you might be involved." The second agent, who had remained silent until now, produced a tablet showing what appeared to be surveillance photos. To James's shock, they showed him and Sarah entering the Historical Society the previous day, with James carrying the padded container that had held the distributor device. "We're particularly interested in the item transported in that case," the agent said. "Our source suggests it may be prototype technology developed by Thomas Reed, whose work has recently been reclassified as historically significant at the federal level." The pieces clicked into place in James's mind. Richard Gentry hadn't just been suspicious about the hidden room. He'd known about it, or at least about Reed's connection to Meadow Creek Farm. And he'd leveraged that knowledge to bring in federal authorities who could legally confiscate the artifacts before James could fully understand their significance or potential. It was a clever move. By involving the federal government, Richard had created a situation where the innovations would either disappear into a government archive, or more likely be studied and eventually released into the public domain, where Gentry Agricultural Technologies, with its vast resources and manufacturing capabilities, could implement them before smaller operators could hope to catch up. Either way, Richard would get what he wanted, preventing James from using Reed's innovations to save Meadow Creek Farm, or worse from Richard's perspective, developing them in ways that might challenge the agricultural status quo that benefited large corporate entities like his own. "The items in question are not on the property at this time," James said carefully, buying time while he considered his options. "And I'm not convinced your warrant is valid without specific identification of what you're looking for." "We can resolve this quite simply," Richard interjected smoothly. "James, you're facing foreclosure within weeks. I'm prepared to increase my offer for Meadow Creek Farm substantially, enough to clear all debts and provide you with a comfortable new start. In exchange, you simply need to sign an agreement transferring all historical artifacts found on the property to the Riverdale Historical Society." He gestured toward Sarah with calculated politeness. "Dr. Mitchell can oversee proper preservation, the federal authorities can conduct any necessary research, and you can walk away from this failing farm with financial security. Everyone wins." The offer hung in the air between them, its implications clear. It was a way out, a path that would resolve James's immediate financial problems while appearing to preserve the historical significance of Reed's work. but it would also ensure that the true revolutionary potential of the innovations would be controlled by the very interests Reed and his great-great-grandfather had sought to circumvent. James felt the weight of generations pressing upon him, the legacy of innovators who had chosen to hide their work rather than see it co-opted, and the expectations of a grandfather who had carefully orchestrated this moment of decision. The choice he made now would determine not just his own future, but potentially the future of farming itself. And as Scout's barking intensified from inside the house, James realized his grandfather had been right about one thing. Some burdens skip generations until they find the right shoulders. The question now was whether his shoulders were strong enough to bear this particular burden, and in which direction he would choose to carry it. James sized up the situation on his porch with the practiced assessment of a former business strategist. Sheriff Mills looked uncomfortable with his role in this confrontation. The federal agents were simply doing their job, operating on information they'd been fed. And Richard Gentry was the puppet master, using legal mechanisms to orchestrate the outcome he desired. "Before I make any decisions," James said carefully, "I'd like to speak with my attorney." Richard's confident expression faltered slightly. "This is a straightforward offer, James. Financial security in exchange for historical artifacts that belong in proper institutional hands anyway. Why complicate matters?" "Because those artifacts represent my family's legacy," James replied evenly, "and I'm not about to sign them away without proper legal consultation." Agent Hoffman nodded professionally. "That's your right, Mr. Wilson. However, our warrant remains valid. We'll need to inspect the premises for the items in question." "Go ahead," James gestured toward the house. "But as I said, the items you're looking for aren't here." As the agents and Sheriff Mills entered the farmhouse, James drew Sarah aside, speaking in a low voice. "Did you know your great-great-grandfather worked for Cornell Agricultural Equipment as their patent attorney? That he was involved in the lawsuit against Reed and my ancestor?" Sarah's expression registered genuine shock. "What? No, that's not possible. My family was school teachers and ministers until my grandfather's generation." "According to Tom Baker, my grandfather discovered the connection during his research," James continued, watching her closely for any sign of deception. "James, I swear to you this is the first I've heard of it," Sarah said, her voice urgent with sincerity. "If it's true, it's been hidden from our family history as thoroughly as Reed's innovations were hidden in your basement." Her reaction convinced him. Whatever connection might exist between Sarah's ancestors and the Cornell lawsuit, she clearly had no knowledge of it. Which raised the question, had Richard Gentry known about this connection when he orchestrated this confrontation? Inside the farmhouse, the federal agents were conducting a methodical search, focusing particularly on the basement. Scout had been relegated to the back porch, where his agitated barking had subsided to occasional grumbles of canine discontent. Richard approached James with the confident stride of someone who believed victory was inevitable. "They won't find anything, will they? Because you've already moved the artifacts, the distributor device, the journals. They're at the Historical Society, aren't they?" James maintained a neutral expression. "You seem remarkably well informed about items I supposedly haven't discovered." "Let's stop playing games," Richard said, dropping his voice. "I know about Reed's connection to this property. I know about the hidden room. My company has been researching Thomas Reed's lost innovations for decades. Do you think it's coincidence that Cornell Agricultural Equipment eventually became part of Gentry Agricultural Technologies? So, you've been watching Meadow Creek Farm all this time, James realized, waiting for someone to find what was hidden. Not actively, Richard admitted. The connection was nearly forgotten until your grandfather started making inquiries a few years ago. That caught our attention. We've been monitoring the situation discreetly ever since. And when I inherited the farm, we accelerated our timeline, Richard said with a businessman's pragmatism. Harold's letter to you was the final confirmation we needed. We just weren't certain exactly what had been preserved or where. The implications were staggering. Richard's company had maintained awareness of Reed's innovations for generations, tracking the Wilson family through time, waiting for the moment when the hidden legacy might resurface. Why not just offer to buy the farm years ago? James asked. When my grandfather was struggling financially. Richard's expression tightened. We tried. Harold refused to sell, regardless of the price. He was committed to his principles. I had hoped you might be more practical. From inside the house came the sound of the agents discovering the hidden room. Raised voices and the tread of hurried footsteps signaled that the search had entered a new phase. James made a decision. The innovations you're looking for aren't just historically significant, are they? They still have practical applications that could threaten your business model. That's oversimplifying a complex situation, Richard replied smoothly. Some of Reed's theoretical approaches might have limited applications in specific contexts, but implementing century-old technology at scale would be impractical and economically unsound. Then why are you so determined to control it? Richard's composure slipped momentarily, revealing the calculation beneath the cordial exterior. Because chaos serves no one, fragmented agricultural approaches undermine efficiency and standardization. The modern food system requires consistency, predictability, economies of scale, even at the cost of sustainability, soil health, water conservation, James pressed. Those are marketing terms, Richard dismissed with a wave of his hand. The reality is that feeding the world requires industrial approaches. Reed was an idealist whose time has passed. Agent Hoffman emerged from the house, his expression a mixture of professional interest and confusion. Mr. Wilson, we've located what appears to be a concealed room in the basement. However, it's largely empty except for a desk and empty shelving. If artifacts were stored there, they've been removed. As I stated, James replied calmly. The agent consulted briefly with his colleague, then addressed James again. Our warrant extends to any location where these items might reasonably be stored. That would include the Historical Society building. Sarah stepped forward, her professional demeanor firmly in place. The Historical Society is a registered repository for items of historical significance. Any artifacts housed there are under proper curatorial supervision, which would exempt them from seizure under Section 7 of your own federal guidelines. Agent Hoffman seemed taken aback by her specific knowledge of the regulations governing his authority. We would still need to document and verify the items, Dr. Mitchell. Of course, she agreed smoothly. During normal business hours, with proper procedures in place for handling fragile historical materials. I'm sure you understand the importance of following established protocols for artifacts of this age and significance. The exchange was buying time, but James knew it was only temporary. Once the federal agents gained access to the Historical Society, the distributor device and journals would be documented and eventually became part of the public record, exactly as Richard Gentry wanted. Sheriff Mills, who had remained largely silent during the search, approached James with an apologetic expression. Sorry about all this, Jimmy. Just doing my job. I understand, James assured him. He'd known Sheriff Mills his entire life. The man had coached his Little League team and had been a regular at his grandfather's infamous 4th of July barbecues. How's Katie doing at college? The sheriff brightened at the mention of his daughter. Full scholarship to Penn State for agricultural science. She's determined to figure out how to make these small farms viable again. Says the big operations are killing the soil and the rural communities both. The comment sparked an idea in James's mind. a possible way forward that might honor his grandfather's intentions while circumventing Richard's legal maneuvers. "Sheriff, would you give me a few minutes to discuss options with Dr. Mitchell? I think we might have a solution that satisfies everyone's concerns." The sheriff nodded, clearly relieved at the possibility of resolving the situation without further conflict. As he moved away to speak with the federal agents, James turned to Sarah. "I need to know something, and I need absolute honesty," he said quietly. "What do you believe should happen with Reed's innovations? Not academically, not practically, but morally. What's the right thing to do with this legacy?" Sarah considered the question carefully, her expression thoughtful. "They should be developed and implemented in a way that honors Reed's original vision, helping independent farmers work with their specific land in sustainable ways, rather than imposing standardized industrial approaches that benefit corporate interests at the expense of soil health and rural communities. Even if that means corporate agriculture loses some control over the market." "Especially then," Sarah replied with conviction. "The consolidation of agricultural technology has created vulnerabilities in our food system and contributed to environmental degradation. Reed and your great-great-grandfather weren't just trying to protect their patents, they were trying to protect a vision of farming that worked in harmony with natural systems rather than attempting to dominate them." Her answer confirmed what James had begun to suspect, that Sarah Mitchell was motivated by genuine concern for agricultural history and sustainability, not by corporate interests or family connections she hadn't even known existed. "I have an idea," he said, "but it's risky and I'll need your help." 20 minutes later, James addressed the assembled group on his front porch. Richard Gentry stood slightly apart, his expression guarded, as he sensed his carefully orchestrated plan might be unraveling. "I've made a decision regarding the artifacts. Discovered at Meadow Creek Farm," James announced formally. "Effective immediately, I'm establishing the Wilson Reed Agricultural Innovation Trust with the following stipulations." He outlined his plan with the precision of a business executive, presenting to a board of directors. The trust would hold legal ownership of all artifacts and intellectual property derived from Thomas Reed's innovations. The physical artifacts themselves would be housed at the Riverdale Historical Society under Sarah's professional curation, with federal authorities granted full documentation access. However, James continued, the practical application of Reed's technology will be developed through an open-source agricultural technology initiative, headquartered here at Meadow Creek Farm. Any patents derived from Reed's work will be held by the trust and licensed for nominal fees to independent farmers and small agricultural operations, with sliding-scale costs for larger entities. Richard Gentry's face had darkened with each detail. "That's not a viable business model," he objected. "Development costs alone will be covered by a combination of grants, research partnerships with agricultural universities, and a significant personal investment," James interrupted smoothly. "I've already spoken with several potential partners who are very interested in sustainable agricultural technology that can be implemented without massive capital investment." This was a calculated bluff. James had made no such arrangements, but he had recognized that the value of Reed's innovations made such partnerships entirely feasible, especially once word spread about what had been discovered. "As for the financial situation of Meadow Creek Farm," James continued, "I've arranged refinancing through the Agricultural Heritage Foundation, which provides specialized loans for historically significant farm properties." Another creative improvisation, but one that Sheriff Mills inadvertently supported by mentioning good folks over at Heritage. They helped the Johnsons save their place last year when the bank was ready to foreclose. Agent Hoffman had been listening to the exchange with professional interest. This arrangement would satisfy federal documentation requirements while preserving appropriate curatorial standards, he observed. From our perspective, this could be an acceptable resolution, provided all items are properly registered with the National Agricultural History Archive. Richard Gentry was not so easily placated. This is absurd. You're proposing to give away valuable technology rather than allowing it to be properly developed by experienced agricultural engineering firms. Not giving it away, James corrected. Democratizing it, exactly as Reed and my great-great-grandfather intended. The innovations will be developed, but in a way that benefits independent farmers rather than further consolidating corporate control of agricultural technology. He turned to face Richard directly. You're welcome to license the technology like anyone else, but you won't own it, and you won't be able to bury it to protect your existing equipment lines. Richard's expression hardened into barely contained fury. This isn't over. There are legal precedents regarding abandoned intellectual property, historical patents with modern applications. My attorneys will be very busy, Sarah interjected calmly, especially given that I've already filed preliminary historical protection documentation with both the state and federal archives, specifically citing the unique distributed development model Mr. Wilson has proposed as essential to preserving the historical integrity of Reed's vision. She had done no such thing, of course, but the confident assertion caused Richard to hesitate, uncertain of his legal ground in the face of such specific claims. I think we're done here, James said with finality. Sheriff Mills, agents, thank you for your patience. I'll be in touch regarding formal documentation procedures for the artifacts. The federal agents, having achieved their primary objective of locating and establishing a documentation process for the historically significant items, were content to withdraw with assurances of future cooperation. Sheriff Mills seemed relieved that the situation had been resolved without further escalation. Richard Gentry lingered as the others departed, his composed businessman's demeanor returning after the momentary lapse. You've made a serious mistake, James. Reed's technology isn't viable without significant modernization and capital investment. You're condemning his innovations to obscurity all over again. I don't think so, James replied. I think I'm giving them exactly the future their creators intended, one where they serve the land and those who work it, not corporate quarterly profits. Idealism is expensive, Richard warned. My offer remains open for 48 hours. After that, you're on your own against my legal team and the bank's foreclosure proceedings. With that parting shot, he returned to his SUV and drove away. Gravel spraying from beneath the tires in a physical manifestation of his frustration. When they were alone, Sarah turned to James with a mixture of admiration and concern. That was brilliantly improvised, but you realize almost none of what you proposed actually exists yet? The trust, the partnerships, the refinancing. Details, James said with more confidence than he felt. The important thing was establishing the principle and undermining Richard's legal strategy. Now we have to move quickly to make the vision real before he regroups. Sarah's expression was both excited and apprehensive. This is going to be an enormous undertaking. Are you sure you want to commit to this path? Richard's offer would solve your immediate financial problems with much less risk. I'm sure, James said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. My grandfather believed this was the right course. Something in me agrees with him. The work began that very afternoon. Using Sarah's academic connections, they reached out to specialists in agricultural history and sustainable farming technology at several universities. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Thomas Reed's name still carried significant weight in certain academic circles, and the prospect of discovering his lost innovations generated tremendous interest. Within days, a preliminary advisory board had been assembled, including professors of agricultural engineering, soil science, and rural economics. A patent attorney specializing in historical intellectual property agreed to help establish the legal framework for the Wilson Reed Agricultural Innovation Trust, working pro bono in exchange for being associated with such a potentially groundbreaking project. The bank, initially skeptical, became more cooperative when several agricultural technology investment groups expressed interest in providing bridge financing while the longer-term financial structure was established. The possibility of Meadow, Greek farm, becoming a research and development center for sustainable agricultural technology suddenly made the property much more valuable than simply its acreage and outdated buildings. Throughout it all, James worked tirelessly, drawing on his business experience to coordinate the rapidly evolving project while continuing to manage the day-to-day realities of the farm. Scout remained his constant companion, seeming to understand that something momentous was unfolding around him. 2 weeks after the confrontation on the porch, James and Sarah stood in the hidden room in the basement, now transformed into a secure documentation center where Reed's journals were being carefully photographed, transcribed, and analyzed by a team of graduate students from Carnegie Mellon's Historical Engineering Department. "Your grandfather would be proud," Sarah observed, watching as the students meticulously recorded details from the technical drawings. "This is exactly what he hoped would happen." "I'm not sure even he imagined it would unfold quite like this," James admitted. The pace of developments had surprised everyone involved. News of Reed's rediscovered innovations had spread through academic and agricultural circles with remarkable speed, generating excitement, particularly among advocates for sustainable farming practices. "I've been thinking about what Tom Baker told you," Sarah said after a moment, "about my supposed family connection to Cornell agricultural equipment. Have you found anything to confirm or refute it?" Sarah nodded. "My grandmother had an old family Bible with genealogical records. There was a great-great-uncle named William Mitchell who worked as a corporate legal advisor in Philadelphia during the 1870s. The family rarely mentioned him. Apparently, there was some scandal that made him the black sheep of that generation. Could he have been involved in the lawsuit against Reed and my great-great-grandfather?" James asked. "It's possible," Sarah acknowledged. "The timing fits. But if so, that connection was deliberately obscured in our family history, perhaps out of shame once the truth about Cornell's tactics became known." The revelation added another layer to the complex historical tapestry they were uncovering. "History is never as straightforward as we think," James reflected. Everyone involved was navigating their own understanding of right and wrong, their own personal and professional pressures. "Which makes what we're doing now even more important," Sarah emphasized. "We're not just preserving artifacts or developing technology, we're honoring the ethical vision behind Reed's innovations." Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, dusting the fields of Meadow Creek Farm with white. Through the small basement window, James could see the pristine covering beginning to transform the landscape, much as the discovery in the basement wall was transforming the farm's future. The sound of vehicles on the driveway signaled the arrival of the agricultural engineering team from Penn State, who would be conducting the first practical tests of Reed's irrigation system concepts, adapted for modern materials and implementation. Among them was Sheriff Mills' daughter Katie, who had eagerly joined the project as a research assistant when she learned of its focus on sustainable technology for independent farms. "Ready to head upstairs?" Sarah asked, gathering her notes. "The engineers want to review the preliminary testing schedule with you." "In a minute," James replied. "I'd like a moment alone here first." Sarah nodded understanding and made her way upstairs, leaving James in the small hidden room where Thomas Reed and James Wilson had once made their fateful decision to conceal their innovations rather than see them controlled by forces that didn't share their vision for the future of farming. James ran his hand along the edge of the desk, where Reed had likely worked on his designs, feeling a profound connection to the men who had occupied this space a century and a half earlier. They had faced a choice between personal gain and principled action, choosing to protect their vision even at great personal cost. Now, generations later, James found himself making a similar choice, forgoing the easy financial security Richard Gentry had offered in favor of the more difficult path of honoring Reed's original intentions. The parallels weren't lost on him, nor was the role his grandfather had played in orchestrating this moment of decision. "I think I understand now, Grandpa," he said softly to the empty room. "Why you left things as you did. Why you believed. I needed to find this myself." From upstairs came the sounds of activity, voices discussing technical specifications, the movement of equipment, Scout's excited barking as he greeted the newcomers. The farm that had seemed so silent and forlorn just weeks ago was now humming with renewed purpose. James took one last look around the hidden room, then turned toward the stairs. The past had delivered its message. Now it was time to build the future it had made possible. 6 months later, the transformation of Meadow Creek Farm was well underway. The Wilson Reed Agricultural Innovation Trust had been formally established, with an impressive board of directors, including agricultural scientists, sustainable farming advocates, and representatives from family farming organizations. The first, modernized version of Reed's variable irrigation system had been successfully tested on a 10-acre section of the farm, demonstrating water savings of nearly 40% compared to conventional methods while maintaining equivalent crop yields. Patent applications were pending, with licensing agreements structured to prioritize accessibility for small and medium-sized farm operations. Richard Gentry had followed through on his legal threats, filing a series of challenges based on historical intellectual property claims. But the carefully structured trust, combined with the clear historical documentation of Cornell's unethical actions against Reed, had thus far withstood these challenges. More significantly, public opinion had solidified strongly in favor of the trust's open development model, making Gentry's attempts to gain control appear self-serving and contrary to the public interest. The farmhouse itself had been partially renovated, with the morning room converted into administrative offices for the growing research team. Reed's hidden room had been preserved exactly as found, now serving as a historical exhibit for the agricultural scholars and sustainable farming advocates who regularly visited to learn about the rediscovered innovations. Spring had returned to Pennsylvania, bringing with it the familiar rhythms of planting season, but now infused with new purpose and methodology as Reed's approaches were implemented using modern materials and technology. The fields of Meadow Creek Farm, which had lain fallow the previous year, were now showcase plots demonstrating various sustainable farming techniques derived from Reed's original concepts. James stood on the porch in the early morning light, watching as research assistants prepared soil monitoring equipment for the day's work. Scout lay contentedly at his feet, gray muzzle resting on paws that occasionally twitched with remembered energy. Sarah joined him, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Their working relationship had evolved over the months, deepening into something neither had anticipated but both valued increasingly. The shared mission of bringing Reed's innovations to life had created a bond that transcended professional collaboration. The university team wants to expand the water conservation trials to the Western Field, she reported, handing him one of the mugs. The preliminary data is even better than they expected. James nodded, taking a sip of the strong black coffee. Reed knew what he was doing. It's remarkable how many of his approaches align with what modern sustainability science is just now discovering. He understood that working with natural systems is more efficient than trying to overcome them. Sarah agreed. That's what made his innovations so threatening to companies like Cornell, and why they're so valuable now as we face climate challenges. From the driveway came the sound of an approaching vehicle. Tom Baker's weathered pickup truck appeared around the bend, moving at its usual unhurried pace. The neighboring farmer had become an integral part of the project, contributing generations of practical knowledge that helped bridge the gap between Reed's 19th century concepts and modern implementation. "Morning, you two," Tom called as he climbed out of his truck. "Brought those heirloom seed varieties we talked about. Thought they might work well with Reed's variable depth planting system." The easy collaboration between academic researchers, technology developers, and practical farmers had become the hallmark of the Wilson Reed project. Ideas flowed freely, tested against both scientific rigor and generations of agricultural experience. "Did you see the news?" Tom asked as he joined them on the porch, nodding toward Sarah's tablet. Gentry Agricultural Technologies announced a new sustainable farming initiative yesterday, claiming they've been developing water conservation technology for years. James smiled wryly. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery and corporate damage control. "They're trying to get ahead of what they know is coming," Sarah observed. "Once our first systems are widely available, their conventional equipment lines will look increasingly outdated and resource-intensive." The three stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the morning sun illuminated the fields of Meadow Creek Farm. Fields that now represented not just the continuation of one family's agricultural legacy, but a potential turning point in how farming technology was developed and shared. "Your grandfather told me once that every field tells a story if you know how to read it," Tom said reflectively. "The patterns of growth, the way water moves across the land, how the soil responds to different treatments." He said the Wilson men had always been good listeners when the land spoke. James considered this as he surveyed the property that had nearly slipped away from him, now renewed with purpose that extended far beyond its boundaries. His grandfather had been right about many things, about the value hidden behind the basement wall, about James's capacity to understand and appreciate that legacy, about the importance of timing in revealing long-buried truths. Most of all, Harold Wilson had been right, that some burdens skip generations until they find the right shoulders. Shoulders strong enough to carry not just the weight of the past, but the responsibility of transforming that inheritance into something that could shape the future. As the day's work began in earnest around them, James felt a deep sense of connection to the land beneath his feet, to the innovators whose vision had been preserved in a hidden room for generations, to his grandfather who had trusted him with this legacy, and to the growing community of collaborators who were helping bring that vision to life. What had begun with a simple puzzling instruction, "break through the north basement wall," had opened not just a hidden chamber, but a pathway to possibilities that would extend far beyond Meadow Creek Farm, potentially transforming agricultural practice for generations to come. And as Scout rose and stretched, ready to accompany his master into another day of discovery and implementation, James knew that he had found something far more valuable than the treasure some might have expected. Behind that basement wall, he had found purpose, connection, and the opportunity to honor the past by creating a more sustainable future, the most precious inheritance his grandfather could possibly have left him. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.